Well, we've been talking about hope and finding hope in hopeless situations, and this morning we're going to look at one of the more dramatic passages in all of the Old Testament. And I want to say before we jump in, every day of life is simply not a big dramatic event. Have you noticed the different personalities? Some of them are drawn to and seek drama. Others just want to drink their coffee and be left alone. But when something happens, like the fires on Maui, the nation turns its attention and watches. So the passages of Scripture we're going to look at this morning are dramatic. But remember, years go by during the biblical history where nothing happens at all. Sometimes our lives feel that way. Is God really at work in my life? Just another day, just another, But He is able, more than able, to do what He says and to do it even in dramatic fashion. So we're going to look primarily into the book of Exodus chapter 14, and I want to read you the passage because just telling it to you in story form isn't good enough. Reading Exodus 14, some before and a little bit after, it's amazing what took place long ago. Let me set it up for you. This is a recap of leading up to Exodus 14, and it goes back to Israel as a fledgling nation. 1,876 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, Jacob, one of the 12 sons, or Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, went down to Israel. Actually, it was Jacob that took his sons, and the family moved to Egypt. 1,876 BC. 1,446 BC, 430 years later, was what we call the Exodus, after which the book is named, where the nation of Israel, which had gone from the 70 people that went with Jacob down to Egypt, they had grown in 430 years to millions. We don't know the exact number. Huge number of people. In that period of time, and if you read the book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 6, it says, "Now there arose a new Pharaoh in Egypt that knew not Joseph." Because Joseph had been the number 2 man politically in the nation. He had saved the nation in a time of famine. But now, and it wasn't just the next king, it was a few pharaohs later, Israel had grown so much that the Egyptians feared them, enslaved them, put them to work building the great cities of Egypt. So God called Moses, who was raised and educated in Egypt, committed murder, ran to the backside of the desert, and spent 40 years following sheep. You talk about a big period of life in which nothing happened. 40 years following sheep. God appeared to him in a burning bush and said, "I want you to go back to Egypt and you're going to deliver my people." And Moses started to give every excuse he could think of. "Well, not a good idea. I can't do it. I'm not the guy. Get somebody else." And God finally started to get a little bit angry with Moses and said, "Let's go, buddy." Only it was in Hebrew, I'm sure, whatever he said to him. And Moses went back and got the elders of Israel together and said, "God has sent me." And Moses went to the Pharaoh to ask if he would let the people go. Now just think about it in every way. Here's Egypt, one of the most powerful countries on earth at that time. And they have an entire group of millions of people that are slaves and helping do the work, if you will. Slaves doing the work. So Moses, whoever Moses is, comes back and says, "Let my people go." And if you're the Pharaoh, how do you not laugh? What are you talking of? That would be the stupidest thing I could do. So if you know your Old Testament, you know that 10 plagues in a row, and I mean plagues, on the country of Egypt, dismantled their economy, their agriculture, their everything. The ruination of the most powerful nation on earth because God miraculously did 10 plagues. Let me just give you a quick reminder in order of what they were. The first one, blood. God said, tell Pharaoh, I'm going to turn all the waters, the river, everything's going to turn to blood. Some scholars like to say, well, there's red mud on the Nile, and so it was kind of the floods and the muddy water. I like to think God's able to do anything. I'm going to go with blood because that's what it says. And the Egyptian magicians did the same thing. Okay, Pharaoh said no. Second, frogs. How many of you love frogs? Well, we're not just talking a pet frog, ribbit. We're talking so many frogs. They were in the house, they were in the yard, they were in the streets, they were everywhere. And finally, when Moses called off the plague, they all died and they made heaps of them, and it smelled delightful in the land of Egypt. The third one wasn't announced. Moses announced to Pharaoh the blood, the frogs. The third one, God just said, throw this ash into the air and lice. Now, I don't know about you, but I remember years ago when my daughter came home from school with lice. Oh, that's not something I like to even admit publicly, but it was long enough ago that I think I'm okay. Oh, we had to wash the sheets every day and the pillows and her clothes and get the special shampoo, and they go, oh, gross. And that was just a few lice. They're hard to get rid of. This says everybody had lice on them. The Pharaoh had lice. The magicians couldn't copy that miracle because they were getting the lice off of them. And after the lice went away, flies. I'm always amazed at how flies appear. There can be no flies anywhere. All you have to do is go outside, open your food to have a picnic, and flies materialize out of thin air. But we're not talking just a few flies that you're having to, do this. We're talking swarms of flies. Swarms of flies. Some translations say gnats. Either way, not nice. After the flies, livestock. And it says here for the first time that there's a differentiation because all the animals of the Egyptians, their donkeys, their livestock, their sheep, their camels, they had a terrible disease and they started dying off in droves. Not in Israel. Not in the land of Goshen where they lived. After the livestock, again, it wasn't announced. Boils. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand if you've ever had a boil. It's kind of personal. But if you've had one, you just try to think about multiple boils all over. Pharaoh called in the magicians to see if they could get rid of them. They couldn't even stand before Pharaoh because they were in pain, racked over with boils. Then hail. I've been in central Nebraska and seen what happens to a field of corn where serious hail comes. It just strips them down to stalks. So agriculturally and food-wise, Egypt's being ruined. After hail, locust. Whatever's left after the hail, locust, who swarm. And I don't know, do they have locust in Hawaii? They are. We're not just talking grasshoppers. No, we're talking, they can be this huge grasshoppers that devour anything organic, just cleaned the land out. And then darkness. And again, it says darkness in Egypt so that they couldn't see their hand in front of their face. But where Israel lived, they had plenty of light. You had to believe something was going on here as the country of Egypt just continued to be ransacked. And finally, God spoke to Moses and said, okay, one more. I'm going to kill the firstborn of every living thing, animals, people, the whole 9 yards. And God instituted what we know today as the Passover. And he gave very specific instructions. You take a year-old male lamb, no defects, and the evening before, you kill it and take some of the blood and put it on the doorposts of your house so that when the destroyer, the angel of death, comes by, if you have the blood on your door, you're covered, no damage, no death. If you do not have the blood, the firstborn in every household would die. What an awful, it took that dramatic power of God for Pharaoh to say, that's it. So let me read. I've got a lot of scripture to read here. I'll try to read fast, but put yourself in the situation. If you've been an Israelite living your whole life in Egypt, you've known at this point nothing but servitude. It's not like you have a bank account, you're looking forward to retirement. You just work till you die. And the Egyptians were heavy-handed taskmasters. So the first section of scripture, I'm just calling it how to make an exit. It says here in chapter 12, beginning in verse 29, at midnight, God struck every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, right down to the firstborn of the prisoner locked up in jail, also the firstborn of the animals. Pharaoh got up that night, he and all his servants and everyone else in Egypt. What wild wailing and lament in Egypt. There wasn't a house in which someone wasn't dead. Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron that very night and said, "Get out of here, be done with you. You Israelites, go worship God on your own terms. Yeah, take your sheep, your cattle as you've insisted. Just go, get out of here. And oh, by the way, would you bless me?" Which is, I thought, kind of interesting to do. Anyway, the Egyptians couldn't wait to get rid of them. They pushed them to hurry up, saying, "We're going to die if you don't get out of here." So the people, Israel, grabbed their bread dough before it had risen, bundled their bread bowls in their cloaks, threw them over their shoulders. The Israelites had already done what Moses had told them. They'd asked the Egyptians for silver and gold things, and they asked, and God saw to it that the Egyptians liked the people, so readily gave them their gold and their silver, everything they asked for. The Israelites moved from that point from Ramesses to Succoth. Now, it's hard to even picture something like this. Scholars estimate that there were probably as many as 3 million people that left. 3 million people. I mean, family camp, we have what? Just 3 million people. In fact, I even looked up the numbers. Let's see if I can remember what it was. Oh, yeah. The state of Hawaii population as of a couple of years ago is 1.41 million. In other words, you take everybody on every island out here in the Pacific Ocean, double it. That's how many people we're talking about leaving Egypt. That is a lot of, how do you care for a crowd? How do you direct a crowd? How do you even do that? 3 million people. The Israelites moved on from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot. That's the men. Then you put their wives, their kids, and you get up to the bigger number. 600,000 plus dependents. There was also a crowd, I love this. This is the message, by the way, so it's older. There was also a crowd of riffraff tagging along. Not to mention the large flocks and herds of livestock. Well, I thought they all died in Egypt. No, the Egyptian livestock died in Egypt. The Israelites had all of their herds and livestock. They baked unraised cakes with bread dough they had brought out of Egypt. They hadn't raised, it was made without yeast because they'd been rushed out of Egypt and didn't even have time to fix the food for the journey. The Israelites had lived in Egypt 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, God's entire army left Egypt. God kept watch all night long, watching over the Israelites as he brought them out of Egypt. Because God kept watch, all Israel for all generations will honor God by keeping watch this night, a watch night that we call the Passover. And when Jesus in the upper room with his disciples centuries later celebrated that special meal with his disciples, that was the Passover meal. And the instructions in the Old Testament are they were to eat it with a staff in a hand and their belt on, ready to go, because when God struck Egypt and the firstborn, Egypt just pushed them out and they had to be ready to go, and they did. They left 430 years to the day since Jacob came down from the land of Canaan. Wow, what an exit. In the end, they were pushed out. Well, the next section, I'm skipping through is in chapter 13, and I entitled this section, Better Than a GPS System. By the way, coming back to Hawaii, I didn't have a GPS when I lived here years ago, but man, is it ever handy. I've discovered you can get really, I call it downtown the soup. You can get turned around and GPS is nice. Anyway, how do you lead 3 million people? It so happened that after the Pharaoh released the people, God didn't lead them by the road through the land of the Philistines, which would have been the shortcut. For God thought, you know what, if the people encounter war, they're going to change their minds and go back to Egypt. So God led the people on a wilderness road, looping around to the Red Sea. The Israelites left Egypt in military formation. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for Joseph had made the Israelites solemnly swear to do it, saying, God will surely hold you accountable, so make sure you bring my bones from here with you. He didn't know it was going to be 430 years, but they did it. They moved on from Succoth and then camped at Etham at the edge of the wilderness, and God went ahead of them, get this, in a pillar of cloud during the day to guide them on the way, and at night in a pillar of fire to give them light. Thus they could travel both day and night. The pillar of cloud by day, the pillar of fire by night, never left the people. I mean, how cool is that? We've read it. I remember seeing it on a flannel graph in Sunday school when I was a little boy. But imagine the presence of God in visible form so you know where to go. How many times in my life have I wished there was something akin to a pillar of cloud? I didn't know which way to go. I didn't know what decision to make in life. God, show me. You probably all prayed that at one point or another. What's your will? What am I supposed to do? Wouldn't it be great to have a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire? This is how God led 3 million people for a long, long time. The visible reminder that God is leading us. And in this day and age, even though we are indwelt with the Holy Spirit of God, for some reason it's easy to forget that. That God leads and guides, not with a pillar of fire and cloud, but he leads and guides us as we tune in, as we stay connected to God, in fellowship with God. He can prompt us with his Holy Spirit as to what his will and direction is. Wow. A clear reminder of God's presence. The next section I'm calling Second Thoughts. It's in chapter 14. When the king of Egypt was told that the people were gone, he and his servants changed their minds. It's hard for us to get our heads around the emotional state in Egypt. Every house had experienced death. And Pharaoh, who considered himself a god and all-powerful, even his house had experienced death. And when you experience the death of a loved one and a family member, there are several emotions that work their way through. For some, it's denial. That may turn into anger, grief, all kinds of emotion. Well, I think probably just a few days went by and he changed his mind. He and his servants changed their mind. They said, what in the world have we done letting Israel, our slave labor, go free? What are we thinking? So he harnessed his chariots up and got his army together. He took 600 of his best chariots with the rest of the Egyptian chariots and their drivers coming along. Apparently there were two classes at least of chariots, the best chariots and then the other guys. But anyway, a whole bunch of chariots. God made Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, stubborn, determined to chase the Israelites as they walked out on him without even looking back. The Egyptians gave chase, caught up with them, where they had made camp by the sea. All Pharaoh's horse-drawn chariots and their riders, all his foot soldiers there at Pi-hahiroth, opposite of Baal-zephon. Now, it's interesting today to try and figure out, okay, where was this actually? And different Bible scholars have different ideas and try to figure out where was it exactly. I think it's interesting that God hasn't definitively it was right here. Oh, there are scholars that believe they know for sure, but what is Baal-zephon? What is Pi-hahiroth? We're not entirely sure. We do know this. Israel went right down against the sea, which if you understand military strategy and that kind of warfare, wasn't a good place to go, because if the sea's behind you, you can't back up. So there it is, second thoughts. And this is what I love. And all the way through the rest of the book of Exodus and Numbers, well, more in Deuteronomy, you see the nature of humanity and particularly of these people. Now remember, they just watched God destroy Egypt with 10 unbelievable plagues. Things that were clearly the hand of God. And now, every day, they had a pillar of cloud and a pillar of... They had the presence of God visible. You'd think they would just totally be trusting God. Well, They heard the chariots, and here's the reaction. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up and saw them. Egyptians! They're coming to get us! And they were totally afraid, and they cried out in terror to God, and they told Moses, now, isn't this perfect? The sarcasm is great. Weren't the cemeteries large enough in Egypt so that you had to take us out here in the wilderness to die? What have you done to us taking us out of Egypt? Back in Egypt, didn't we tell you this would happen? Didn't we tell you, leave us alone in Egypt? We're better off as slaves in Egypt than corpses in the wilderness. Unbelievable. You know, sometimes you almost wonder if complaining isn't a spiritual gift because people are able to do it so readily. Oh, man, you know, I got to tell you, this is a pastoral confession. We, in the churches I pastored, every week we have a space for prayer requests, but often what it became was a way to anonymously complain about something they didn't like in church. They never put their name on those. But, and I mean, I'm just telling you, this is my confession, some of them were hilarious. Unbelievable. They come to worship God, and their response to the day is, it's too cold in the auditorium. And in the same week, right behind that car, it is so hot in here. Send somebody do something. You know, yeah, we're here to worship God, but it's either too cold or too hot, or the music's too loud, or the music's too modern, or I don't like the pastor's haircut, or, you know, just unbelievable. So this is the nature of humanity. When we're uncomfortable, when we don't like something, wah, 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 we complain. And that's exactly what the children of Israel, I knew this was a bad idea. Anyway, complaining is not a spiritual gift. Well, the next section I've entitled, Stop Your Whining. And this is Exodus 14, verses 13 and 14. Moses spoke to the people. Now, if I were Moses at this point, I'd be tempted to kind of push back and let him have it verbally, but here's what he says. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Stand firm and watch God do his work of salvation for you today. Take a good look at the Egyptians today, because you're never going to see them after today again. God will fight the battle for you. And then he adds this, and you keep your mouth shut. Well, it makes me feel good that he would actually say something like that. Put a sock in it. You know, nobody likes to have the complaints leveled at them. And Moses, I thought he showed great restraint there. Stop your whining. The next section I'm calling protection and guidance. I mean, I wonder how it went this night. It says, the angel of God who had been leading the camp of Israel, now shifted and got behind them, and the pillar of cloud that had been in front also shifted to the rear. The cloud was now between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel. How awesome. I'm trying to picture how this went. The cloud enshrouded one camp in darkness, that would be the Egyptians, and flooded the other with light. The two camps didn't come near each other all night. Isn't that? Can you picture this in your mind? I just wonder, did anybody sleep all night? You know, here's this, the pillar fire cloud is here. The Egyptians are on the other side. It's all right, honey, go to sleep. It'll all be, I'm not sure I would have been sleeping that night. But God protected them as well as guided them. The next section is where the drama picks up. And if you've read the passage, and I'm going to assume most all of you have, this is just unbelievable. It says in verse 21 of chapter 14, God had already explained what he was going to do. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and God, with a terrific east wind all night long, made the sea go back. He made the sea dry ground. The sea waters split. The Israelites walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground with the waters a wall to the right and to the left. Unbelievable. And some, more modern theologues would like us to believe, well, it was a very shallow part of the Red Sea, and it did. No, it wasn't. In fact, I gotta share. I don't want you to feel like we're going to the movies, because we do movie night usually on Friday night. But one of the great movies. In fact, my family didn't go to the movies when I was growing up. That was, But the first movie I was allowed to go see was called The Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille. It was filmed in 1956. They had no technology. They had no computers. They had none of the stuff they have today that can make Star Wars look so real. This was 1956. And I want to show you the big blow. If you've seen, you already know what's coming. It's a couple minutes long. But with me, let's stand with Moses and watch what God does to provide for the children of Israel. Let's go with that video. Sometimes a movie or someone's idea of how it looked can just stir our own imaginations. And hard to imagine what it would have been like to have your back to the wall, hopeless situation, we're all going to die, and then God provided in such an unbelievable, powerful, distinct way. He parted the sea, and they went through. Millions of people, an entire army that had the capacity to wipe them out, which was their intent, and God provided. And I just think our lives aren't nearly so dramatic. And yet, every one of us at some point in life or another has faced what seemed to be an impossible situation. There's no way to fix that. There's no, I'm going to be blamed. I'm going to lose how much money. This is the worst. And probably not the worst, but it could be pretty bad. And we forget that our God is all-powerful. Now, He doesn't promise us that He's always going to open the sea up in a way that's like, because truth be known, and we've talked about this, often our prayer requests are because our comfort, our finances, our health are the thing that's on the line. And just like with Hezekiah last week, here again, the prayer is that Pharaoh may know, that the world may know that there is a God in Israel. It always comes back to a demonstration of who He is and why He is. You walk through the Gospels and you see Jesus heal people, and it's easy for us to say, oh, God heals, and I want Him to heal me. He always did so with a purpose, and it was always so that the world watching might identify, this is the one, this is the Messiah, this is the Son of God. That's why those miracles were done, not just so people would be healed. I mean, he had control over nature and stopped storms. He brought back from the dead people that had literally died, not swooned. He healed the blind man, the paralytic, on and on and on, to show who He was. And that's what the power of God in Exodus is about too, that the world may know. Well, the next section, after the big blow, a life-changing event, is called the Big Splash. You got to love this. The Egyptians came after them in full pursuit, every horse and chariot and driver of Pharaoh racing into the middle of the sea. And we already saw that. It was now morning watch. God looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud on the Egyptian army, and He threw them into a panic. He clogged the wheels of their chariots. I don't know specifically what that means, but all of a sudden it was not easy going for them. They were stuck in the mud. I thought it was dry ground. It was for Israel. Apparently not for the Egyptians. The Egyptians said, run from Israel. God is fighting on their side than against Egypt. And God said to Moses, stretch your hand out over the sea, and the waters will come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots, over their horsemen. And Moses stretched his hand out over the sea, and as the day broke and the Egyptians were running, the sea returned to its place as before. God dumped the Egyptians in the middle of the sea. The waters returned, drowning the chariots and the riders of Pharaoh's army that had chased after Israel into the sea. None of them survived, but the Israelites walked right through the middle of the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall on their right and on their left. That is amazing. In fact, it's so cool. We got to watch a little bit more of Cecil B. DeMille just to see what happened. So I love this movie. Pretty cool for a 1956 movie, huh? So what'd you learn at church today? We watched the Ten Commandments. I just wanted you, with as much color and those incredible orchestral scores, just to maybe feel a little bit of what might have been what it was like when God delivered Israel, millions of people, out from a hopeless situation, one they had no power to deal with themselves, so that the world would know, and it did know. Years later, when Israel entered the Promised Land, we heard what your God did for you in Egypt. They knew that there was a God in Israel. And then the resulting party I'll just mention before we wind down here. God delivered Israel that day from the oppression of the Egyptians, and Israel looked at the Egyptian dead washed up on the shore of the sea and realized the tremendous power that God had brought against the Egyptians. And here's the bottom line. And they feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Many scholars say at that point, that construction grammatically is the same as when Abraham believed God and it was accredited to him as righteousness. Same construction, and they believed in the Lord. Many scholars believe this is when the people that passed through the Red Sea put their faith in God in a salvific way. Anyway, they saw it, and then Moses and the Israelites sang this song. Wouldn't you love to hear this? I mean, talk about a new chorus. They broke out, and I think there was dance. How could there not be dancing? One minute you're dead, and the next minute you see a miracle unlike any other in all of human history, and you're saved, you are delivered from the power of death. And they sang, giving voice together. I'm singing my heart out to God. What a victory! He pitched the horse and rider into the sea. God is my strength and song, and yes, he's my salvation. This is the kind of God I have, and I'm telling the world, this is the God of my fathers. I'm spreading the news far and wide. And the song goes on for all of chapter 15, and then Miriam comes up with her own little refrain, and they were singing. I mean, could you imagine? Could you imagine the celebration because they saw the power of God and what was a hopeless situation was turned completely around? Now, I know, and if you know your Old Testament, you know it didn't take long for the complaining to start again, but in that moment, they believed in God, and God turned their lives around. Now, I don't know what may be happening in your life today. Maybe it's a skate right now. Maybe everything's good. Everybody's healthy. You're employed. You're able to pay your taxes, and life is good. And that's great. The writer of Ecclesiastes say, in the day of prosperity, be happy. Thank God. Enjoy life. But in the day of adversity, consider God has set one against the other so that man might not know what's coming next. And it may be you're under the circumstances, so to speak, this morning. Maybe you feel like your back is to the wall. And I would never want to raise false hopes by saying, God is going to divide the sea for you. But I do know this, God will make a way for you. A number of years ago, one of the biggest churches in the country in Illinois was experiencing some real hardship, and the staff got together to meet, and they didn't have any answers. They didn't know how to handle the problem they were facing, which seemed insurmountable. And one of the worship leaders had his guitar in the staff meeting, and he just started creating a chorus. And it said, God will make a way where there seems to be no way. Incredible chorus. Churches just sang it. The Promise Keepers movement picked it up, and it was sung for years and years. And as we close our service this morning, I'd like for us to sing that, especially if you feel like you're in a situation that does not have an answer. You don't have a pillar of fire or smoke to follow to know exactly what you ought to do. But I can promise you the same God that made a way for Israel is a God who still today, different means, still is capable and will make a way regardless of the issue that you or I face. He's that kind of God. Sometimes the very reason that he allows us to face the impossible is just to find out if we will trust him, if we will lean into him as opposed to come up with our own ideas and our own, we'll figure this out. It just may be that God this morning is waiting for you to watch him make a way where there seems to be no way. Would you bow your heads with me as we thank him for his truth this morning? And Father, on some days in life, it just seems there is nowhere to turn. Whether we're talking about our health, whether we're talking about our financial situation, whether we're talking about a marriage that's gone south and it just seems like it's so broken, there's no way to fix it. So many situations in life seem impossible and certainly above our ability to cope with. Thank you for the truth that God will make a way where there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. He will make a way for me. He'll be my guide, keep me close to his side, and every day work in our lives. Thank you for that truth. Thank you for the dramatic story of Israel being delivered, being saved from sure death, because you made a way. And as you made a way for them, you certainly work in our lives as well. And we thank you for it.